alert.
Okay.
Great. Hi, so I'm here with Chloe Messdaghi. And Chloe, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. I am the founder and principal of Impactive Consulting. I basically help companies mitigate risk, enhance trust, and also become purpose-driven.
Great, great. So Chloe is an expert in various realms and a leader in a lot of domains within cybersecurity. So one of the areas in which she's an expert is vulnerability disclosure policies. So what are vulnerability disclosure policies?
Yeah, so vulnerability disclosure policies, I might go by VDPs, basically lets the hackers in the community or your security researchers in the public basically report a vulnerability that they find. So if they find a bug and they want to report it, who do they contact? What does that process look like? What is in scope, what's out of scope when I'm trying to find out what's appropriate or not to report? And that's really important because what this does is allow us to use all these incredible people that are volunteering their services to basically let you know, hey, we found a vulnerability. We think it's important for you to fix. And also for them to be aware of who to contact. And usually what happens is that we have security researchers all around the world. They go by hackers. And then you have attackers or the malicious actors. And these are the ones that, are basically doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And what is happening is that when they basically find the vulnerability, they're not going to report it. Instead, they use it for their own gain. And so it's important for us to have a place to communicate, to let a company know, hey, I found a vulnerability before an attacker takes advantage of that vulnerability. Now, the thing is about 94% of the Forbes Global 2000 list still don't have vulnerability disclosure policies. And so what does this mean is that if I, myself, a hacker, security researcher, finds a vulnerability, I don't know who to report it to. So I might slide a DM on Twitter or on LinkedIn, let them know that I found something. I'll go to help, I'll go to customer service. I will do whatever I can to let you know I found a vulnerability because I think it's important for you to fix it. But what ends up happening is all those channels are usually marketing, and marketing doesn't work with security. If anything, it's very siloed. And so when I contact marketing, let them know I found a vulnerability, they'll probably send me to the PR team or their legal team, not to the people that I want to go and fix this vulnerability. And then what ends up happening is the security researchers are just trying to report a bug that they found, is then having to deal with a legal case. And so this is the situation that we're in, and why vulnerability disclosure policies are important, because they tell us what's okay, what's not okay, who to contact, so then we don't have to run hoops around someone, and we can actually fix the vulnerabilities that we find so attackers don't take use of it.
That's really great. Yeah, I mean, it's really important just to have that, kind of integrated into the whole process, and for ethical hackers to not fear doing what they're doing to protect these systems and these companies in our world. And so anything else from a company perspective regarding vulnerability disclosure? I see why you call it VDP.
Yeah, it's very long, right? I would say that it's so important for companies to do it because, one, it will get those vulnerabilities fixed way faster. It's protecting your organization because these people are letting you know before an attacker takes advantage of it. Attackers don't report. That's not what they're supposed to be doing, and they don't do that. But it also helps you get out of a bad PR situation. And I like to use the Equifax as an example because the security researcher found the vulnerability that basically became the headlines 5 months later, and he or she reported this vulnerability, and they didn't fix it. And then we had the whole Equifax breach headlines. So these are things to think about, is that when we have vulnerability disclosure policies, we're actually making companies more secure, but also it's a way to avoid having risks and PR situations down the road.
You know, I always find that, you know, it's good to kind of sell, yeah, any sort of company on security, from, you know, tying it into reputation and brand and PR. And it's also interesting what you mentioned about, you know, marketing being the person who really gets things out to the public, and yet just kind of another opportunity for unfortunate miscommunications and you know, misinformation or disinformation, more likely, because intention is the distinguishing factor there. Yeah, I mean, that's all really, really, really important. So, and so it then has a great you know, impact on DevSecOps processes in that regard, right?
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and then the policy behind it is just so important. So I guess that kind of ties into the more micro level, if you will, um, coming from the policy side more to the, you know, the individual on the micro level. You also lead the hacking is not a crime initiative. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Hacking is Not a Crime is an initiative that's more of a grassroots, in a sense that we have all these people in the hacker community that are trying to take a stand, to inform the public the difference between a hacker versus an attacker. And what the thing to know about the both parties, they use the exact same skill sets, however the intent is different. Hackers, also go by security researchers, are people that are staying within scope. They're not exploiting for their own gain. They're just trying to protect and also alert companies when they find a vulnerability. Attackers, on the other hand, once again, they use the same skills, but the intention is different. For them, it's for their own gain. So that might be information as a power. That could also mean a resource power, but also that means financial as well. And so Hacking is Not a Crime, the initiative was basically born to showcase that there's a difference between these two parties, and they're not the same, because for the longest time, just in general, society has always believed they're the same thing. And because of that, it's very hard to form any new policies that would protect security researchers. And this becomes one of those problems because there's constant fear in our community when we're doing our work that we might get a lawsuit, which is crazy, right? If we are hired to do that work, we can always face a lawsuit. And so this is the thing, is that we have to change where we are today with legislation to protect hackers, so then they're able to report vulnerability safely. And that's why that vulnerability disclosure policies are really important, because it at least like provides that bridge until we have legislation change.
It's very important indeed. Yeah, I'm glad to see, and you know, actually have been part of some working groups about that, to try to, you know, inform and just, you know, bridging communication and informational gaps between policy and practitioners. It's so important. Um, and you know, I'm also a very proud advocate of Hacking Not Crime. If you check out on Twitter, you know, I proudly share that there, and I try to spread the word as much as possible in daily life, because again, I agree that it's so important. And the whole concept of vulnerability disclosure and, you know, any sort of open source security is that it really helps the tooling and the people and processes, you know, all the people and processes and technology to be able to do what they need to do in the DevSecOps movement. So yeah, I mean, it's really important topics. Yeah. And so do you think that there's anything, I guess, more identity related as far as, the individual side or, the cultural side in the ethical hacking community.
By identity, do you mean like reclaiming the title hacker?
Well, I guess, so yeah, sorry, I wasn't clear. I mean, I guess mainly in terms of, becoming an ethical hacker and, kind of fears or self-doubts, whether it be a matter of being a minority in the ethical hacking community. And I know we both do a lot for
Yeah.
diversity, or whether it be, kind of having that internal fear that also, or misconceptions yourself that other, I guess others have sometimes that act as a barrier. And then so people who could very well easily develop the technical skills based on, you know, other work that they've done, but don't necessarily join the movement because of some sort of, hesitancy. Um, so I guess that could be fear or also culture.
Yeah, I mean, so generally hacker community, it seems to be accepting of people's identities. You are who you are, come as you are. I think people value people being transparent versus like faking anything. And that's one thing that is brilliant about the hacker community is that we want you to be yourself. And there's so many different types of people that are in this field. So you do find people that are like-minded like yourself, or share same identities as yourself. And that's the one thing is finding those little niche groups. That takes a lot of digging, of course. But when you find them, they are a wonderful group to be a part. And that's how it is in like almost every industry, is that you have to find your own people in a sense. So then you feel comfortable in your own space. But it is one of those things that you have to go out of your way to look for it, which is unfortunate because that's where we are today, is that we have to go and take the initiative to find groups that we can connect with. And that's one of the things that I look forward to in the future, where it's not like I have to go out of my way to find groups. Instead, like you feel belonged in, and not just that, but also there are plenty of people that have similar background as you that are also in the space. So it's not much of a search. I think that's one of the things is identities come as you are. Don't fake it. People don't like people that are being fake in the community. Be real and look for groups that support you. I am a co-founder of a group called We Open Tech, and basically it's for all marginalized genders, and even male cis allies can join as well. And what it is basically changing the talk about women versus men in a situation. Instead, we're talking about all genders. If we want to talk about equity and equality amongst all genders, that means we need to have all genders in the room. You can't ignore. And that means also having gender representation. Gender is on a spectrum, and we have to come to understand that as a society as a whole. And so We Open Tech, we basically have doors open no matter what your gender is, and you believe in equality and equity, and you believe in wanting to change things, and you want to be around people that are like-minded as this. It's an open community. It's completely free, and it's just us coming together and knowing you have a safe environment. I think that's one of the things that I when I first got into cybersecurity, I just didn't know where are the safe environments or where are the belonging environments. But when I did, it was fine. I didn't want to leave at that point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, finding that sweet spot, it just takes time and effort. And I've definitely, so I've been asked questions, what group should I join, this, that, the other. And I always say, like, I can't answer that for you. You have to figure it out yourself, enjoy the process. If one doesn't work, do not worry, because there are so many others, and you will find something. It just might take time. And, and depending who you are, that could be at a conference, that could be at, I guess, on some sort of Slack or Discord channel, depending, especially when it comes to ongoing initiatives and conversation, and definitely for open source projects, finding, continuous discussion or development of a project to be able to continue with that. Yeah, and it takes time. I mean, that's just a great answer. Feeling safe, feeling comfortable, and being yourself is just so true. Nobody wants, I mean, of all the things that, we lack time for in terms of trying to secure our world, we don't have time for discrimination or judgment. That's one thing that we can really immediately skip. And so that's on the security researcher, ethical hacking side. So a few questions about the, kind of defensive and DevSecOps movement. What are some ways that we can more effectively educate developers about security?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's always like this silo between the two parties, like developers and security, and they don't really mingle. I think what we need to do is be more transparent with one another. And what that means is bring in security very early on. So if we're talking about a new innovation, new product, a new service, have security in that room. Usually what ends up happening is the security is not brought into the conversations until after the product roadmap has been developed and that the product is already in the works. So the earlier we could bring security in, the better, because I know it might slow down the process, but it's important that we create secure products. And so that's my number one recommendation, is just create bridges between these two parties, discuss who's responsible for what. And that's really important when it comes to fixing vulnerabilities, because sometimes what will end up happening is the developer creates the code, and then the code has a vulnerability in it, and then next thing you know is that the security folks are trying to send it back for developers to fix it, but if developers already has moved on to a different thing at this point, so it's kind of frustrating to go back into it and like try to fix it, versus security folks, sometimes they're forced to actually fix the vulnerability themselves. And so I think it's really important is to talk within your organization about who has the responsibility and when of anything that's created, and what does that process look like. Having thorough conversations, communications, but it's really important that we bring your developers and bring your security in the room when you start discussing a new product. They need to both be involved early on in the stages.
Well said. Well said, yeah. So I guess, so in that regard, I guess in addition to internal operations, security has, I guess, various obligations for developers. So, I mean, I think you already answered this in your previous question, but any other ways that security can help developers?
I think just having conversations, have them be in the room. I mean, it's like one of the most simple things. It's just having them in the room, having social gatherings, doing like a coffee break on Zoom. I mean, they should know each other and they should discuss what helps them, what hurts them, because both parties are very integrated. They have to be integrated to have good products. Like when we talk about risk is very much part of this game, which is if we're siloing our security folks from our developers, we're going to hit some risks later on. It's better to just have them work together, find out what works for them, who's responsible for what. And I think that's really important that, the company also enforces those changes. it can't be between the two teams. It's also going to be from the top as well, because I don't think change can really happen unless you have it from the top as well, agreeing to it and enforcing.
That's a really great point in terms of like, the team and organizational dynamics. It's so true. And yeah, I mean, especially when tooling and, research and, I guess specifically research backed tools um are, are already developed, and a lot of it really is about those operations. Um and I guess when you get training on around the tools, and also any facilitation of that consistent communication is really where the sweet spot is. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad communities like the ones you've mentioned, and like OWASP and like the SNEAK community, are continuing to kind of facilitate that in an open manner externally, in addition to a company. So, and what is the biggest risk at this time for security, and why?
Oh, I'm gonna be honest, communication. I think at the end of the day, it's gonna always be communication. I think we really need to work on that. I think what ends up happening is that we have different, everyone is different in this industry, right? Everyone has a different way of functioning, different way of relying on information and retelling information. And it could become kind of like a telephone game. I don't know if you remember this, but as a kid, basically someone whispers in your ear something, and then you pass it on to the next person, and then they pass it on to the next person, and then to the next person. Next thing you know is that the line, which was, it was sunny while it rained, is now like a squiggly arm is now a croissant or something. Like it's just gonna be completely random. That doesn't make any sense. And that's what we always see. When a security person tells someone about an issue, it's not about dumbing it down. It's about being transparent and being very specific. Understanding that not everyone thinks the same way as that other individual. And so we have to try to do better in communication. So we're not playing the telephone game, because that's going to make our vulnerabilities that we're trying to fix at the time, or if we're dealing with a breach, especially during a breach, you see this a lot, is that it's going to take a longer time to fix and to recover. So that's why it's really important that we work on communication styles. We also work on understanding that not everyone is like us and processes information the same way if we're having communication, and to be as calm and resilient and just understand that we all think differently. And so we need to learn how to communicate in a way where other people can understand at the same time.
Excellent, excellent. And I know you have a background in neuroscience, so it seems to come into play quite often. If you want to speak more about that, please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, for me, I was always a big fan of the amygdala, which is this is like survival mode in your brain. It's completely subconscious, but it basically tells your brain whether to run away or to stay still, or to fight it off. And so I think that's one of the most interesting, is that survival mechanism in our brain. And we have no idea why it does what it does, but basically uses your subconscious memories, and basically is like, okay, this is a threat, this is not a threat. And I just find that really fascinating. It's just knowing that, everyone has a choice on whether to act on an action. That's something empowering. So even though the amygdala is completely subconscious, it has to send a signal to a conscious part of your brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, which is like the front of your brain. It acts like the CEO. And then that part of your brain tells it whether or not to simmer down or to act on the perceived threat or action. And I think it's really important for us to always remember that we always have a choice. We have to really think through our decisions and not be don't be just like making actions without thoughts, in a sense. Be very understanding of why we do what we do. And is that actually a threat, or are we projecting? And so I always find that part really fascinating.
That is fascinating. Yeah, I mean, in terms of who, really what goes behind the scenes of, both security people, developers, and, we really are all stakeholders at the user end too. Those factors apply. And, also in terms of, engagement with security and with, and how we interact with technology in general. So, as far as, tooling or, any sort of educational platform per se, um, then, having it be, having it, I guess, resonate properly with everyone's brains from an accessibility perspective, or just in general, I guess, from a cultural perspective. And I guess, language in that sense, being more customized than just, English versus French, for example. Having it be, really resonate with us, with each of us personally. And I guess, that kind of, I guess, those kind of neuroscience concepts, which I think about is, the fight or flight, then that could lead to, either success or burnout, depending on how we handle it. And I know you've also given some great insight to the community about burnout. So if you want to speak a little bit more about that specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times that we hear executives talking about like, oh, our security team is completely burned out right now. I think it's the pandemic, and then I have to come and be like, it's not from the pandemic, it's before. The reality is that how we work as industry is 24/7 every single day. Even when we're off, it's still in the back of our mind. So there's never really a break. And so how burnout occurs is when we're not balancing our work life from our personal life. But how can you have a personal life balance if you are constantly on call 24/7? And so just knowing that in itself, it's going to lead us to being burned out. And when we're burned out, we're not going to catch certain things that we need to catch as security folks. And this becomes a real problem because we feel like the whole world is on our shoulders. And when we're mentally exhausted, it's even more so overwhelming. And what ends up happening is that our companies are not really dealing with this situation. They haven't been dealing with the situation. And so what ends up happening is you have a really burned out security team. And when we have burnout security teams, that means that not only is that a huge risk situation, but also you have to think about the personal lives of these people that are working on the security teams. Because if we have untreated burnout, that leads to developing actual full dose of anxiety and also depression. And the last thing we want as an employer is for anyone to get anxiety or depression because they work for us. And that's the thing that we have to start looking at as employers is when we talk about our security team, are we giving them the necessities that they need to do well, but also allowing them to have great flexibility? They're going to need more flexibility at this point. Because if you care about your company, you should know that if a breach does occur, that can bring down your entire company. We've seen it before, especially with small and medium-sized businesses. So breaches do matter. So we want to make sure that we are all level-headed and that we're not burned out to the point where when we are dealing with a breach, that we're able to react as fast as possible. And so burnout does matter. And it's something that it's a huge problem. I mean, honestly, it's not just burnout, but also we're talking about PTSD also on security teams. So we need to do whatever we can to change how we function. And that might be an industry-wide situation, or that might be an employer situation, but we need to do better, because we're going to keep losing security folks, going to other industries. But also we should care. We should care about the employees on security teams. We don't want them to be drinking more because of our company, right? We don't want them to have to go see like a psychologist or a psychiatrist just because we're doing bad micromanaging practices. Like, that's the things that we need to think about, is how are we making the situation better and how are we making the situation worse? And that might be a really hard thing to look in the mirror to do.
So true. Yeah, I mean, another thing, any of any practices within an organization, or like, at the individual level, it's just so hard to kind of recognize these things and shift in real time as needed. So just, yeah, being cognizant of everyone's mental health throughout is so important. So important. Yeah, I mean, you really can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah.
Right. So what do you see as the next biggest risk for security in the next 10 to 20 years?
So this is a controversial one, and that would be sustainability. And I would say that we have to really start caring about climate change. And that's something that we don't talk about at all. We just don't talk about climate change in our industry, but we are going to definitely be impacted by it. And we already are, right? Think about the pandemic. The reason that, we're going to keep having more pandemics is because of climate change. So what happened during the pandemic? Overall, for our businesses, we all had to work remotely. I mean, these things come with risks. So if we don't think about climate change impacting our business, we are making a grave error. And so, I mean, we have to think about how our planet is changing. We're having more droughts. We're having really bad droughts in California right now. And so what does that going to look like in the future? That means that people are probably going to start moving away. That means they're going to go to areas where there is water. That also means that on the East Coast, we're going to have more storms. That means more power outages. That means flooding. That's going to impact our business. At the end of the day, those things are going to impact our business. And we have to start really understanding what else is in play, right? So if climate change gets worse, resources are going to matter a lot more, especially water, fresh water. And so what does that look like? That means that maybe in the future, we're going to have more attacks going towards our resources. That's our new cyber war playground. It's going to be who has the resources. That means on food, that means on water, and energy. And so we have to really understand that we're not ready. Companies are not ready for this period. But it's going to take every company and individual to start playing a role in ensuring that we reduce the probability is our planet's getting warmer. But there is a point where we can actually not necessarily reverse it, but we can make the conditions a little bit better in the near future. And so that means really thinking about what we're driving, how much are we driving, what we're consuming. When we go to conferences, it's important that we do hybrid models. And the reason for that is that if we just did in person, that means think about all the transportation that went into going to a conference. And then think about all the swag we give out at conferences, which are like, majority is plastic. And as we know, it takes about 400 years or more for it to decompose. So these are things we have to understand. We play a huge role, and we have to make sure we're going to be as secure as possible when it comes to guarding resources. And we have to think about when it comes to workplace culture, things are going to start shifting, like we have noticed from the pandemic. And I know that's a controversial point because there's still people in our industry that don't believe in climate change, but the reality, it's very much real and it exists and it's human derived. So that's the thing I think that is I'm looking forward to getting more involved in, and giving more conversations about that and helping employers do better in that front, because we're not ready. Like our industry in particular is not ready for climate change. Like if it gets worse. And that's a scary thing, because that means all these businesses are at risk, and people as well.
So true. Yeah, I mean, all the different impacts it could have on a, on a business, security, and otherwise on people, and just entire geographic regions. It's so true, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it's often missed kind of as a security issue, and it's really important. Yeah, it's. I always say that if you want to follow a leader, both in security and also other sorts of activism and essentially our world in terms of impact, then follow Chloe Messdaghi.
Oh, thanks.
You just know so much. And I think, your various areas of expertise, from policy, neuroscience, specific implications of that, and, in terms of our industry, burnout, gamification, etc. You really are proof that, the more you know, and the different, the more types of perspectives you can speak to, the more successful you are in being a leader within our industry.
Yeah.
And I admire you so much for that.
Oh, well, thank you. I admire that you're always doing work for women in cybersecurity, and giving platforms and putting them in spotlight. It's great. We need more of that, right? But yeah, and I think it's just important for all of us, just in general, is I know we're all burned out and we're tired, but it's really important that we also don't just always focus on security as security folks. That means reading books that have nothing to do with our field or industry, because it gives you a different lens and it allows us to connect things that we didn't think of before. Like all these ideas I've ever had is because I came from a humanitarian perspective, and I read a lot about like social issues, and then I connect those dots. That's how it is. It's just get outside of your bubble, learn about the world, and you'll see where more things need to be focused on. And I think that's what we need. We need to all just ask the question, how can this be better? What can I do to make this better? And just take actions, ask.
Those are amazing calls to actions. That's a great ending point, because, yeah, and anyone who's viewing this afterward, please ask yourselves those questions and follow Chloe. Yeah, and also, and hack, and all of her organizations. Thank you again so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Awesome.